everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a great conversation about how states can use data to strengthen their teacher pipeline. My name is Abby Cohen. I'm a senior associate at the Data Quality Campaign, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Angie Tombari from the Kentucky Center for Statistics and Elizabeth Ross from the National Council on Teacher Quality. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone is muted during the presentation, but please feel free to send questions along as they come to you. You're welcome to chat them into the chat box, and then we have folks here who are compiling them, and we've saved a good amount of time for the end of our conversation to do a Q&A because we know that that's usually the most helpful part of these webinars. So please feel free to send those through. And so with that, we're going to get started. I think I'm going to kick us off and just help ground us in why we're having this conversation right now. I think this is the topic of our teacher pipeline, and the need to understand where our teachers are coming from and where they're going is a conversation that we've had for a long time, but we have seen a resurgence of the conversation around teacher shortages, especially in the last year. And I think despite these sort of continued concerns on this topic, we know that most states don't have the information that they need to really understand the state of their teacher pipeline and the extent to which they have a shortage, they don't have a shortage, and if they do, what are the steps they need to take to really address them. So specifically, we're talking about teacher supply data from educator preparation programs, and then teacher demand data coming from districts or local leaders who are doing the hiring. And so without this data, we really can't answer important questions that we might have about our pipeline. And more importantly, we can't craft really targeted, tailored policies to address these needs. At the same time, we also know that colleges of education are experiencing, in some cases, a decline in enrollment or a mismatch between the majors or the concentration areas that teacher candidates are choosing, and then the subject areas or locations that are deemed high need. So I'm really excited today to dig in with our panelists to talk about the unique role that the state can play in breaking down these silos and connecting the dots between teachers that EPPs are preparing and the needs of the districts who are planning to hire them. And in addition to talking about the value of connecting this information, we also want to talk about the value of sharing that information back out with those who need it to make decisions, whether we're talking about the general public, other state policymakers, local leaders, education preparation program leaders. Everyone has a need for this information, and so we have to make sure that we are taking those steps to equip people with the information that they need to make those decisions. So with that, I will turn it over to Elizabeth from NCTQ, who I think might be having some challenge with her webcam, but that's okay. We should hopefully be able to hear her. And she'll give us a great snapshot of what the data scene looks like nationally.
That's exactly right. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Abby, and hopefully everyone can hear me on the line. Please feel welcome to chat me directly if you can. I'm off-site today and apologize that my webcam doesn't seem to have made the transition down to New Orleans as easily as I have. So certainly hope that everyone's doing well. Delighted to have such a good turnout. As Abby mentioned, at the National Council on Teacher Quality, we've been working in this space for some time and did some work earlier this spring to report on the current status of where states are, finding that around half of states are maintaining the necessary data systems to collect teacher supply data, but a very small number of states are doing the work necessary in order to collect those supply data to district level hiring statistics. And the reason that of course is so critical is because when we think about supply and demand issues, we have to be thinking about both ends of the spectrum. It's not enough to know how many teachers we are preparing, but indeed we also need to know how many teachers we need in place. The good news here is this represents a dramatic improvement over where we were in 2013 when our team at NCTQ started collecting these data. At that point in time, we had only 6 states that were tracking teacher production data. Now we see that 29 states are doing that work, and we see 8 states that are actually closing the loop here. And the nice thing about those 8 states that are leading the way is they're putting points on the board. I mean, for each of those states, there is room for improvement and there's additional work to be done. But they are showing what is possible with strong, smart data systems that provide stakeholders at every educational level. So not just policymakers at the state level, also district leaders and also teacher candidates themselves, who can and should be very interested in these data, because particularly on the demand side, these data can provide them with a sense of if and how likely they are to be hired in the state based on likely and predicted vacancies. In terms of why this is an issue that people should care about, depending on who and where you are in the system, there are lots of different reasons to care about it, but at its heart, it really is an issue of equity. Research clearly and consistently demonstrates that teacher quality is the most important in-school factor impacting student learning and lives. And if we don't have teachers in the classroom, then we know that those students are not receiving a high-quality education. Regardless of whatever metric we use to measure teacher quality, we know that our most vulnerable students continue to have the least amount of access to those high quality teachers. Put differently, when there's a teacher shortage, our low-income students, our students of color, our students with disabilities, and our English learners are most likely to have insufficiently prepared and ineffective teachers. This is also an issue that we can solve. It's not an easy issue to solve. We won't be able to do it without political will and leadership, but as a nation, we know how to address supply and demand problems. We need to decrease production of the areas where we currently have an oversupply, and we need to provide appropriate incentives and supports in order to increase the attractiveness of the positions for which we currently have an undersupply. I'm going to pause there and we can transition to Angie, and then I'd like to talk a little bit more about what kinds of data states should be thinking about collecting, connecting, and ultimately making publicly available.
I'm sorry, Abigail, I couldn't hear you just now.
All right, there, we had a little muting issue, but I was just transitioning to you. We'd love to hear about your work in Kentucky.
So a lot of what Elizabeth was talking about is the sorts of questions that we are, of course, trying to tackle. And we are uniquely situated in some ways because although I work at the longitudinal data system, and unlike in many states, we are located in a slightly separate and non-political system. So we're in the Education and Workforce Development Cabinet, but we ourselves are intended to not make policy, not really weigh in on it, just to give the data and the facts about it. And that's led to us being kind of a center point for finding out information, as well as the fact that we get information from all of these different agencies, and it gets housed here, and much of that through statute. So with that, a lot of the work that we've done around this has started from the top. And it was in questions that people had, particularly our professional standards board, concerning what does it look like actually out there with teachers that are being employed and where they're being prepared, because they had the information on the preparation and they had some information on placement, but not as much as we had. So we answered questions for them like, when teachers first get their jobs, where are they getting their job? And found that something like 60% of them are getting their job in the same geographic region as their education preparation provider. And all of these kind of have snowballed. And it's because we get this data from our professional standards board, which has our certifications, licensure, when they started and finished their education preparation program, along with the data from our Department of Ed. And I talk about EPSB as a separate organization. It has now been reorganized under our Department of Ed, but since most of the work we've done has been when they're separate, I'll probably continue to talk about it that way. Anyway, with that, the Department of Ed has the information about the teachers, but not only the teachers, but their students. So what courses are they in and what students are in those courses? And that allows us to capitalize on different systems that they have, where we have student growth percentiles or things like that, to actually look at the performance of the students with the teachers they have and where those teachers were prepared. And then on top of that, we get some information on the placement as well as the particular job roles. And all of that combined is a really powerful resource that lets us look into a lot of questions. And our target audience is rather broad. As I said, we started with the leadership. They asked questions, but as they asked questions and we tried to answer them, we then heard that we were, at the very beginning, we were butchering the data according to the education preparation providers, and they were correct. So we listened, and I went to a lot of meetings with them, and there are some amazing people in Kentucky that are working in the education preparation providers, really trying to get this data clean and make sure that how we're using it is how they need it to be used and how it's intended to be used and how they're recording it. And then after working with them, we've also worked with different groups that are teacher fellows to find out whether fellowships are actually helping them become better teachers, or is it whatever their goals are, is that actually what's happening out of the program that they're participating in? And then now it's getting to the point where we're trying to really make it something that's available for future teachers. That sort of Elizabeth touched on, picking out a specialty area that you know there's a need for. So something, if you have an array of interests, maybe there are 5 different things you could pursue, selecting some that you know the state needs. They're already doing something that in my mind is very altruistic, as I'm not out there being a teacher. And instead, I work with teacher data, and they're out there in a very difficult environment choosing to teach these subjects that are tough with kids that sometimes don't want to learn and sometimes do. And then the biggest piece of it is that once we get an answer, it has to get out there. So, and some of that, I am not the visualization lead. So if you have visualization questions, I'm sorry, I'm not the person to answer it. However, we have some exceptional people in here who take the data that I pull out of the system. Logan Rupard and Scott Secamilio at our agency do brilliant jobs taking data I pulled for them and turning them into visualizations that are understandable and usable and able to be drilled down to a level that individual people can actually use it to make decisions, as well as agencies and individuals at the top, the decision makers that have been elected. And with this, we respond a lot to requests, such as, I now calculate critical shortages for the Department of Ed. And I really love that because it gives us the opportunity in the middle of this. The critical shortages are not only useful for all of the pieces that the federal agencies need it for, but it's also useful for individuals that are trying to follow up on CAPE accreditation. It's a great way to define a high need area. So I'm able to take that information and look at where individual EPPs, the education preparation providers, program completers are actually being placed. And if they're in there, are they teaching and were they prepped in a subject area that is high need for that area? So that's one of the sorts of linkages. And right now I'm answering questions for the education preparation providers on that. But the ultimate goal is to flip that so districts can actually look and say, I know that I'm going to need a science teacher. What institutions near me could I potentially go to recruit people? I've had trouble with it in the past. Who might have someone that could help me? So with that, I will pass it back over to you, Abby.
That's great. Thank you, Angie. I love to hear about the work that you all are doing. And one thing that jumped out to me in particular was, as you're talking about sort of how you all go about this work, how people-centered it can be. And I think sometimes when we talk about data and data systems, we get understandably focused on the technical aspect of it. But in order to make these resources and information really valuable, like you said, we have to be proactively trying to meet people's needs and building relationships and trust. And I think one of the challenges in this area is that it's the intersection of a lot of different agencies and departments, and you have to have relationships with people and have that trust so that they know, they really understand what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, and that you want to be a resource for them. So I was excited to hear you to talk about that and what sort of a central role that plays. And to build off the end of your comments, I'd love to hear from both of you about, what what does having this information really empower people to do? This is not just a recommendation to have a new data collection or to put out yet another PDF resource that hangs out on the SEA website. We are talking about this and advocating for this because it really empowers people to take action and to drive impactful policy. And so I'd love to hear from both of your perspectives of what is the value of this information and what does it really allow us to do?
Thanks so much, Abby. I'm happy to take a first stab at it. And then Angie, please jump in as necessary. At the 30,000-foot level, these data enable us to answer questions. And that's critically important because it's only by answering questions about workforce need, about teacher composition within certain schools, that we can figure out what actions to take in order to incentivize and prioritize teachers to go where we need them most, and also figure out if and where we have persistent oversupply issues, which in some cases we do. In most cases where an oversupply exists, it's in elementary education. How to make sure that those teacher candidates are getting good data up front about the fact that, you know, they may not be able to find a job in state because there is such a persistent oversupply of certified teachers in their area. In terms of the incentivizing piece, it's only when we know that, for example, we have a shortage in one school in secondary sciences that we can think strategically about differentiating compensation in order to make that position more attractive, or thinking about staffing think about a non-traditional staffing model that may take advantage of technology or may take advantage of a certain teacher's expertise across a number of schools if and where it's needed. And so these data are really critical to put good information into the hands of the people who need them in order to make decisions at every single level.
And that's one of the things, jumping in there, we have a report that we designed particularly for the education preparation providers. And I am very fortunate because in Kentucky, we have a whole group that is dedicated to data. They are at least one representative from most institutions, if not all, and they are a small subset of our Kentucky branch of AACTE, right? They come together and they worked with me on designing this report that met their needs and could potentially be used by future students. And in that, one of the ways that we figured out how to approximate finding employment by actual subject area of study was looking for them at how many of them continued on from each completion group. And we broke it down by the program and whether it was mathematics or science or all these things, and mapped it out and said what percentage of them go on to apply for a statement of eligibility saying that they'd like to teach. And then of those, how many get their certification? And the main reason that we try and get the certification is that, the main reason that we do it in that fashion is that from talking to everybody, we found that they're recommended by the EPPs not to go out and get your certification immediately because it costs money. But get your SOE when you get your job, go pay for your certification, because the first certification only lasts a year. And then they have to renew after completing an internship program that we used to have. Because of that, everyone can look through there and you can see by the different area whether people are likely to get a job or if there's an oversupply. So you would see in elementary education that you may have a lot of people getting this SOE, but only a small percentage of them are getting their certification in the given time frame. And that itself can be an indicator for people as to where they might do, or if there's a particular subject, you might be able to double complete, because sometimes it's very easy to add an additional piece at the very end of your program, and they can plan their process accordingly.
That's great. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Abby, this is Elizabeth again. One other point on this that I just love to make. Obviously, privacy is something that can and should be considered when designing and implementing all of these data systems. And when we do see legislative actions to walk back either the volume of data that are collected or the scope or the length of time for which those data are held, frequently it's done because the legislators don't have a sense of what questions are trying to be answered and will no longer be able to be answered if those data systems go away. And so to the extent possible for individuals who might be on this webinar who are thinking about how to convince state policymakers of the importance of these data, really invite folks to consider leading with the questions that currently exist at the state level and at the local level that cannot currently be answered, and thinking then strategically about how to put in place the data systems that will enable those questions to be answered. And so by starting with the questions, rather than, for example, starting with a named data system that is a specific line item in the budget, we find that they tend to survive the test of time, survive the test of political leadership, and ultimately put good information into the hands of people who need it most. And Angela, if you disagree with that in any way or have anything to layer on top, would love to hear your perspective at the state level.
I was going to see that's something that our executive director, Dr. Kate Akers, is absolutely amazing at. She is out there telling everybody what we can do. And then she's there if anyone is trying to change things, just to remind them the questions that we're answering. She's promoting the sorts of information that we can produce. And it's really critical. When I started, when I interviewed where I am, it was a staff of 8. When I was hired, it was a staff of 13. And now it's a staff of 41. So, and I really think that is attributed to her being out there saying that, yes, we can answer these things. And we will find a way. And when we find a way, but we can lay out in a very transparent fashion the assumptions that we had to make because we didn't have these data sources, it can incentivize data collection and also show that the answers we're giving are not compromising anyone's personal information, because it is our data. Everyone who works in this office, our data is in the system as well. And we make sure we want to give as much information as possible within the bounds of making sure that the people in our system are protected.
Those are great points. Thank you. And I think especially right now, as states have put out their ESSA plans, and there are really bold goals in a lot of them, that if we're going to meet those goals or make progress towards those goals, this is such a critical piece of that. We have to make sure that we have high quality teachers in every single classroom and every single subject, no matter where students live. And so if regardless of maybe what a legislator or advocate or leader's particular issue might be, what their pet issue might be, we can only get there if we have high quality teachers. And so I think it's this topic itself lends itself to that strategy, because I think it's something everyone can really understand, sort of no matter what lens they're looking at the issue with. And sort of building off that, as Elizabeth mentioned, only 8 states are connecting this supply and demand information. And so what are the elements that need to be in place in order for this type of work to happen? Who needs to be at the table? How do we've talked a little bit about leadership, we've talked a little bit about culture and building relationships. What are the hallmarks of making this connection happen?
I'm happy to answer generally, and then would love to have Angela walk us through how Kentucky got from a staff of 8 to a staff of 41, because I think that's just going to be a really useful case study for all of us. In terms of generally, as I already mentioned, leadership matters. The other component that is critically important of this work, and this comes from strong leadership, but is a dedication of resources in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of staffing. You need people to do this work, and I know that can be really challenging in a resource constrained environment. And so that is where I think for a state that's having trouble figuring out how to allocate the necessary resources to do some of this work, ultimately the benefit of which will not be realized in year 1, in year 2, in year 3, because the benefit is really a long-term benefit, is to think about the cost benefit analysis in regard to the number of decisions that are being made as basically shots in the dark and therefore being made without good data. And for example, if a state is putting in place an incentive program, it may not be incentivizing the right areas for teachers to go into. We know that supply and demand and teacher labor markets are local, and so what one area needs is not necessarily what another area needs. And so thinking about in investment in a data system as an investment in making good decisions, I think can be really, really helpful and really powerful. In terms of folks who should be at the table, it really helpful and important, and I think as a sector we're getting smarter and better about this, but having some end users at the table, so the teacher candidates who may be interested in digging into it, the families and communities who may be making decisions about where they want their child to go to school, making sure that they have access to those data and access in terms of not just access in terms of a spreadsheet that they can download on a website, but something that they may be able to more easily engage with. And then also thinking about the policymakers that will need to use it, something that can be used and understood by state legislators, by folks at the governor's office, of course by the team at the state educational agency, and by district superintendents and principals, the individuals who are in the position of hiring.
And here I think we do try and do a lot of what you're mentioning, Elizabeth. Mostly, again, Dr. Akers is behind all of this, and a great BA staff, and then of course a great development staff underneath that's integrating all this data. But I remember that multiple years ago, we had a list of stakeholders that we would start. Anytime we do anything, we make sure that we get at the table some of the end users, individuals that are likely, so say for teacher work, that's why we had our EPPs, the Education Preparation Provider Representatives. We had people from EPSB over here. We even had individuals from the Department of Ed over here that were helping to make sure everything was being used. And we had a series of very, very long meetings that everyone was able to talk. And I was very new at the time and just listening. And so I just listened really, really hard and took notes and then clarified. And we had a whole series of these in developing the first teacher prep report. And we also got questions from, we had a very proactive executive director of the Professional Standards Board, Jimmy Adams, and he wanted to know, where the teachers were going, where they were coming from. And part of that was in their decisions about programs, whether you should approve a new program or whether we need to design an accountability system. And not necessarily us, because we don't deal with accountability, but whether EPSB needed to design an accountability system that was going to be able to handle small programs. And yes, they did need to if they wanted a system, because you can't omit those. For us, since you have such a regional bias, you're going to have small programs at pretty much every institution to ensure that even if people aren't moving, you have enough qualified teachers to teach in the schools. And that's, Kentucky people don't really like to move. And we need to recognize that. Maybe you can leverage it later, but it led to him developing a grow your own philosophy for the long run, and also trying to get districts to reach out and try and get student teachers and set up those partnerships. If you have trouble meeting your needs, try and get someone who's going to be finishing a teacher prep program to come out there. And that's pretty much how a lot of this work came about.
That's great. So I hear sort of two different layers. I hear the extreme importance of leadership, having a strong leader at the helm of this work who not only knows the data piece really well, but knows the people piece really well, making sure that the work that you're doing is relevant and valuable to people. And I think that then feeds into what Elizabeth was talking about from the resources perspective, that people are probably more willing to invest time and money and effort into something that where they really deeply see the value and sort of from a state perspective understand how this is important to reaching sort of larger policy goals that the state has put out. And so as we think about that, the last question that I have for the panelists before I open it up to Q&A is why the state? Why is the state best positioned to make these conditions a reality, to help us break down these silos, and why should they really be acting now?
That's great, Abby. I'm happy to go first again, and then Angela, please chime in. So the state is really in a unique position when thinking about this. The state maintains the licensure requirements, and so for all intents and purposes, the state is in a position to be dictating the necessary requirements in order to be teaching in the classroom in front of kids. And the state also, and it differs depending on which state you're in terms of precisely whom in the state, but the state also has some leadership oversight and capacity over the educator preparation programs as an opportunity to support and oversee that body of work. And so the state is really the entity that is appropriately placed and positioned in order to link both the need data from the district and school perspective with the supply data coming from teacher preparation programs, and to the extent to which alternative routes are available in the state coming from alternative route certifications. Unless you have the state playing a role in this space, you're going to end up with two different data sets, which may or may not talk to each other well and may or may not be reporting on comparable data. Ultimately, you won't be able to answer the questions that you want, including things like how many teachers are we going to need in X geographic region, in X subject, in the next 3 years, in the next 5 years. You could potentially, if you just wanted to think about this from the supply side, answer questions about who is it that we are preparing, or if you just wanted to think about it from the demand side, who is it that we have in classrooms now today. But in order to really be proactive, you need to be linking those two data sets, and it's the state that's in the best position to do that.
And you really need to not only link these data sets, but at the state level, as you mentioned, you didn't say it in these words, teacher data is really, really messy.
Yeah.
And it's something everyone can agree on, in my experience, across all sorts of different states. And it's because there's so much that is done at the state level. But you also need that contextual knowledge, because it's not like there's not going to be, they're going to find someone. So you need to be knowing that this is an emergency cert, that they had a teacher, but the teacher was not quite ready to be teaching this. You need to also have that knowledge of what's going on in this region. And then you need to study the patterns across time, because if people are leaving, so for us, most of our supply is going to be new teachers. And most of our exit is pre-retirement attrition. Not retirement, it's people leaving before they hit that point. So we have leaky pipes. But if you don't know why people are leaving, it's a lot harder to predict who might be leaving in the future. If you just think it's all retirement, then your prediction is going to look very different than if you recognize that there are these different subsets of reasons that people leave at different time points, and can say, all right, most of the time when people are leaving pre-retirement attrition, they normally have around 8 years of experience. If you can say something like that, you have a better idea of at what point someone's hitting that potential exit point.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about sort of where the state sits in its ability to connect not only supply and demand data together, but then connect the dots with other information that they have as a result of the role that they're playing more broadly, and understanding any challenges that are identified in the data within the larger context of other workforce issues in the state or other challenges that are being experienced. And so I think that is a unique spot where state leaders are, where they're able to understand what can seem sort of like a narrow topic or a narrow piece of information within a broader context, and again is just empowering people to make better and stronger policy decisions. And I think in education, and probably in many other policy areas, it's easy to get tunnel vision and not think about how these connect to each other. So the more we can talk about these in tandem with each other, I think the stronger our policies will be. So thank you both. I really loved our conversation and appreciate your time. And at this point, I'd love to open it up to audience Q&A. So let me take a look. We got a fair number of questions, so we are going to try to get to all of them. So this question is for Angie. Assuming that we look at providing this data, like the example you provided of where the state has the most need as an intervention, has the agency measured whether these data efforts have been worth the time?
Whether collecting the data is worth the time? Is that what we're trying to address, you think?
I think collecting and then the reports that you're building. Do you feel like you're using it and worth the effort?
I always think it is, and our executive director makes sure the turnaround's pretty fast. So I don't think the requesters necessarily realize how much effort may go into it. But our experience has been that the reports we put out are being strongly used, and that the collection, most of the stuff that we're collecting, say it is an intervention, we're often provided with who the intervention was given to, and we already actually have all the data linked at this point. So then we can just use the system that we already have in place. And it's a relatively easy lift. By creating that interconnectivity, people start to realize you can answer not just these first policy questions, but a whole series of things. And that when a new intervention is put in place, we're sitting right there ready to see, especially if it's rolled out by different locations across time, we can start structuring it. And it helps that we have a staff full of PhDs, masters, data scientists, et cetera, that are actually very research focused and trying to find the best methods for it. So thus far I've never heard anyone say that wasn't worth it, but we're also funded a great deal by grants. So we try and do a lot of the innovative work with grant funding, which allows people to see the capacity that we have.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, I'm going to bundle two together. Someone's asked about who the 8 states are that are doing the connecting, and then more specifically about New York. I'm aggrieved to learn that New York, my state, does not participate in data collection to identify teacher needs. Do you know if this is because New York has a surplus of teachers or it's not prioritizing this? And then how can we get New York State to work with you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Abby. Those are great questions. And would you mind flipping back a few slides?
Sure.
Why don't we stop right there? So I will answer the question about the 8 states, but before we get there, we've learned a lot about Kentucky today, and thank you so much, Angie, for talking us through that. There are 3 other states that really rise to the top when thinking about implementing systems that other states can learn from. Maryland, Massachusetts, and Tennessee are really doing some very fine work in this space. And one of the nice things about pointing to these states and taking a look and digging into their systems, each of them is collecting the data in a slightly different way, presenting it in a slightly different way, but all of them are using it to answer real questions that they have. And via these hyperlinks, which, Abby, I don't know if you have a listserv of everyone on this and could disseminate it afterwards, but we have on our website this short report, only 4 pages, so very easy for folks on the line to engage with, that provides these data, and you can click in and play around and see what these states are doing and how it is working for them. In terms of the other 4 states, Abby, if you wouldn't mind flipping back just one more slide. Oh, and I'm sorry, the other direction. Yeah, thank you so much. We also have Illinois, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Tennessee, and West Virginia. So we do have New York that is doing some work in this space. New York publishes an annual teacher supply and demand report, which includes data on the local number of new teacher hires for a particular year, the number of new teacher hires broken down both by region and by endorsement, and the number of initial certificates issued. They're collecting teacher production data, but those data are not at the program level, and they are not providing acceptance guidelines. So the teacher production data are at the institutional level rather than at the program level, meaning that, for example, a large university in New York, City University of New York, will have one number associated with it rather than numbers associated with each smaller program. And if that didn't adequately answer the question, I'm certainly happy to have anyone follow up with me directly online. I love to talk about these topics, and I'm always pleased to do so.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I'll put a big plug in for the Data Burst. It's a really great resource that just drills down into the topic. It's, as Elizabeth said, it's not very long, so you can fly through it and get the information that you need. I absolutely recommend checking it out, and we'll be sure to send it around, along with a few other additional resources that we've compiled on the topic. Angie, this question is for you. It's specifically about the data that you are collecting or receiving. Do you work to collect annual vacancy data from districts to assess the degree production with vacancy data?
So I know exactly what's being referenced here. And we're actually really fortunate because in our legislation, you actually have to post every teaching job posting for public K-12 teachers on the same site. And so we have this information, and then they post whether it's filled or left unfilled. So I'm actually able to do that in a very easy fashion, in my preferred fashion, by using my computer rather than having to actually go around and collect. And they do survey as well to ask whether they have difficulty filling particular positions. And we just make sure that that survey is aligning to what we're seeing in the quantitative data.
Great. And then our next question is also for you about the platform that you use to collect the data, and do you have a statewide data warehouse?
So we are the statewide data warehouse. I personally am not. However, our developers are the ones who create it, and we have a whole wing of developers here who do the worst of the work, in my mind, making sure the data gets cleaned and put in the same format. So each year we're able to rerun the same scripts or work with the same data. The data does get cleaned over time. So we're getting the data that the Department of Ed is collecting. They are then submitting it to us, and we have the longitudinal data system. Same as EPSB is collecting their data, and then it gets submitted over to us. And as we use it, we find the data has gotten better and better because there is a reason to be very cautious in your data entry and to clean it up if it's actually being used.
Yeah, absolutely. What is it? Sunshine's the best antiseptic. Once it's out there, it's only going to get better. I think, are there any other questions, folks? We have a few minutes left, so feel free to chat any through. As we wait, I would love to put a plug in for the next webinar in this series, which is using data to support a diverse and learner-ready teacher workforce. So we'll be talking with Sarah Delano from Louisiana Department of Education and Christina Dimmitt-Salinas from the Illinois State Board of Education. So that'll be another great conversation. And with that, if there are no other questions, I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy days to join us, and especially to Angie and Elizabeth for taking time out of your particularly busy days. Elizabeth, I know you're traveling in New Orleans, and we're just on a panel on this topic, so you're probably good on supply and demand for a little while. But thank you all, and please reach out if you have any questions. With that, have a great day.
Thanks so much, Abby and Angie. Always so nice to convene with you, and certainly invite anyone on the line who has any questions or thinks that I may be able to be helpful with something to not hesitate to reach out to me.
Wonderful.
And same over here. Thank you, and feel free to reach out to me. It may take